If you've ever been the calmest person in an actual crisis and then quietly fell apart later, once it was safe to. If you can sit with someone through their worst day without flinching, but you also know exactly where your line is when helping starts sliding into enabling. If people call you a soft touch and somehow miss that you're actually one of the steadiest people they know. Welcome. Kindness is doing a lot more engineering under the hood than most people give it credit for. Or maybe you know someone like this. The nurse who stays level-headed in the emergency and falls apart in the car afterward. The friend who says no gently but firmly, and somehow, that no still feels like care. The coworker who notices you're struggling before you've said a single word about it. Here's the first thing worth untangling, because most people use these two words like they're interchangeable. Empathy means feeling what someone else is feeling. Compassion means wanting to reduce their suffering. Those sound similar. They're not the same system at all. Someone can have a lot of empathy and very little follow-through, and someone else can feel a moderate amount of empathy but act with enormous compassion. Doctors, firefighters, and hospice workers often learn this distinction the hard way. On purpose, because absorbing every patient's pain as their own would burn them out inside a month. The skill isn't feeling less. It's learning which part to carry. That distinction shows up directly in the brain, and it's a genuinely strange finding. When people simply empathize with someone's suffering, the regions tied to their own pain tend to light up. When people shift into actual compassion, wanting to help, rather than just absorbing the feeling, a completely different set of regions activates instead. One's linked to positive emotion, connection, and caregiving. Empathy alone can wear a person down. Compassion, when it's the thing actually running, tends to do the opposite. It can leave someone steadier than before, not less steady. Which is probably why the calmest people in a crisis are often the most compassionate ones in the room, not the least affected. None of that means compassionate people say yes to everything, either. A lot of people confuse kindness with an inability to say no, when the healthiest version of compassion usually comes with real boundaries built in. Constant yes without limits isn't compassion running well. It's compassion running straight into burnout. The people who sustain this longest tend to be the ones who can tell the difference between actually helping someone and quietly doing the thing that lets a bad pattern keep going. There's a real reward built into this too, sometimes called the helper's high. Genuine acts of generosity have been tied to reward system activity and a calmer, more energized state afterward. Not guaranteed every time, but measurable often enough to matter. And the effect doesn't stay contained to the two people involved. Watching someone act generously makes bystanders more likely to act generously themselves later, toward people who had nothing to do with the original moment at all. One kind act can genuinely ripple outward through a chain of strangers who never even met the person who started it. So why would a trait like this exist at all if strength and speed seem like the more obvious survival tools? Evolutionary anthropologists argue humans didn't out-survive stronger, faster predators through raw power. We survived because injured group members got cared for instead of left behind. Food got shared, children got raised cooperatively, and older adults stuck around long enough to pass on what they knew. Groups that took care of their vulnerable members tended to outlast groups that didn't. Compassion wasn't just a nice extra. It was a working survival strategy, and it's not even uniquely human. Neuroscientists have watched rats learn to open a container to free a trapped rat with no reward attached to doing it. And in some of those experiments, the rat that did the rescuing shared its treat with the one it just freed instead of eating it alone. Bonobos have been seen comforting complete strangers after a conflict, not just relatives. This instinct is old, and it runs a lot deeper than any one species. Now here's the part almost nobody expects, and it's a little humbling once you actually sit with it. In a famous study at Princeton, Seminary students were asked to walk across campus and give a short talk. Some were told they had plenty of time. Others were told they were already running late. On the way, every one of them passed someone who appeared to be in real distress. The students who thought they were late were dramatically less likely to stop and help, even though a number of them were literally on their way to give a talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan. Compassion, it turns out, isn't purely a fixed personality trait sitting inside someone waiting to activate. It's genuinely fragile under enough time pressure, even in people who care deeply and who, minutes later, were about to preach about exactly this. That's not a flaw specific to those students. It's a real limit almost everyone shares, and worth remembering the next time you're rushing past someone who needs 30 seconds you don't think you have. This is also why what gets called compassion fatigue usually isn't actually caused by too much compassion. Researchers increasingly think it comes from chronic exposure to distress without enough recovery time, an unsustainable workload, prolonged strain, not the caring itself wearing someone down. Compassion isn't the expensive part. Running it without rest is. A lot of what makes compassion effective in practice is a fairly small shift in the question being asked. Instead of what's wrong with this person, compassionate people tend to ask what happened to this person, and that one swap changes the entire conversation that follows. It's also worth being clear that compassion never requires agreement. Understanding why someone is struggling and endorsing what they did about it are two completely separate processes, which is part of why compassionate people can hold a boundary and stay warm at the same time, instead of treating those as opposites. And despite how often kindness gets mistaken for passivity, some of history's most compassionate acts required real courage, wartime rescuers who risked everything to protect strangers. People who told hard truths specifically because they cared too much to stay quiet. Even in the middle of the worst conflict imaginable, this instinct has shown up before. During the winter of 1914, soldiers on opposing sides of World War I climbed out of their trenches on Christmas, exchanged food, sang carols, and buried their dead together, briefly, before the war resumed. It didn't last. It wasn't supposed to change anything strategically. It happened anyway. Which might be the clearest evidence there is that this particular instinct doesn't wait for ideal conditions. It just waits for an opening. One last thing worth knowing, especially if none of this feels like it comes naturally yet. Compassion isn't a fixed trait handed out at birth to some people and withheld from others. Programs built specifically around compassion training have shown that this response can genuinely grow with deliberate practice, the same way a muscle responds to use. Psychologists studying moral development have also noticed that the circle of who someone feels this instinct toward tends to widen over a lifetime, starting narrow with family, then friends, then community, eventually strangers and beyond, rarely shrinking, almost always expanding for the people who keep exercising it. Subscribe and watch this video next.